Leave a comment where you are listening in the world. Please subscribe if you enjoy our content. Enjoy! This happened about 3 years ago. I was 24, newly single, and not really looking for anything serious. I'd been on Tinder for a couple of weeks and had gone on a few dates. Most of them were fine, just awkward or dull, but nothing sinister. That changed when I met Chris. Chris messaged me one night with a pretty normal opener. He wasn't the best-looking guy I'd seen on the app, but he had this easygoing vibe in his messages that I liked. He was funny, attentive, and didn't come on too strong. We talked for a few days, and he seemed normal, like too normal. No weird red flags, no creepy comments. Just a guy who liked hiking, movies, and cooking. He told me he'd recently moved to my city and didn't know many people yet. I felt bad for him, honestly, and I thought, why not? He seems nice. We agreed to meet for drinks at a bar not too far from my place. I made sure to tell my roommate where I was going because, stranger danger and all that. The date started out fine. Chris was exactly like his photos, average height, dark hair, a little scruffy but in a cute way. He was easy to talk to, and the conversation flowed well. I'll admit, after a couple of drinks, I started to feel pretty comfortable around him. Too comfortable, maybe. After about an hour, he asked if I wanted to come back to his place. He said it wasn't far, just a quick drive, and that he'd make me one of his famous cocktails. I hesitated for a second. Normally, I wouldn't go back to someone's place on a first date, but something about him seemed so harmless. Plus, I'd had a little bit to drink, and my judgment wasn't exactly at its sharpest. I told myself it would be fine. I texted my roommate to let her know where I was going, just in case, and got into Chris's car. The drive was short, maybe 10 minutes, but the further we went, the darker and quieter the streets became. His apartment turned out to be a small house tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was cute, but there was something off about it. No lights on in the neighboring houses, no cars in the driveways. It felt isolated. We walked inside, and the first thing I noticed was how empty it was. Like weirdly empty. No pictures on the walls, no clutter, no signs that anyone actually lived there. Just a couch, a coffee table, and a TV in the living room. The kitchen counters were spotless, not even a coffee maker or a toaster. I joked, "Wow, you're either a minimalist or you just moved in," and he smiled but didn't answer. I shrugged it off and sat down on the couch while he went to the kitchen to make our drinks. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The silence in the house was deafening, like the walls were absorbing all the sound. No music, no distant hum of a fridge, nothing. I pulled out my phone to text my roommate again, but when I unlocked it, I noticed something strange. My last text to her, the one where I told her I was coming here, hadn't sent. No signal. "Hey, do you have Wi-Fi?" I called out, trying to sound casual. Chris didn't answer right away. After a moment, he poked his head around the corner and said, "Oh yeah, sorry, the Wi-Fi's out right now." Something about the storm last week messing it up. There hadn't been a storm last week. My stomach dropped, and I started to silently panic. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem scared. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the Wi-Fi really was out, and I was just psyching myself out. But then I started noticing other things. The drink he made me? It was just water with ice. He handed it to me like it was a cocktail, smiling like he expected me not to notice. The windows in the living room? They didn't have curtains or blinds, just large panes of glass that looked out into complete darkness. And the doors, there were 3 of them leading to different rooms off the living room, were all closed. Too closed. I took a small sip of the water and set it down, trying to think of an excuse to leave. "Hey, I just realized," I said, forcing a laugh. "I have work early tomorrow. I should probably get going." Chris's smile faltered. "Already?" he asked, his tone light but strained. "You just got here." "Yeah, sorry," I said, standing up. "I completely forgot I had this thing in the morning." He didn't move. Just stood there, blocking the entryway to the front door. "You don't have to go," he said, his smile returning but not reaching his eyes. "Stay a little longer. I haven't even shown you the backyard yet." "No, really I should," I started, but he cut me off. "You'll love the backyard," he said, his voice firmer now. "Come on. Just for a minute." My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Maybe next time," I said, trying to step around him. But as I did, he grabbed my arm. Not hard, but enough to stop me. "Just one drink," he said, his voice low. "One more drink, and then you can go." His grip tightened, and I realized in that moment that I wasn't getting out of there without a fight. I yanked my arm free and backed away, my voice shaking as I said, Chris, let me go. Now. For a second, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he smiled again, this slow, chilling smile that made my blood run cold. You're not going anywhere, he said. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed the glass of water from the coffee table and threw it at his face, the ice and water hitting him hard enough to make him stumble. While he was distracted, I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock before finally yanking it open and running out into the night. I didn't stop running until I was back on the main road, where I flagged down a passing car and begged the driver to take me to the nearest gas station. From there, I called the police. When they arrived at the house, it was empty. No furniture, no Chris, nothing. Just an abandoned shell of a house. The neighbors said no one had lived there for years. So before I go into the story, I'll just explain that in the lead up to this particular incident, I had a number of strange attempted break-ins and occurrences. So much so that I had to install cameras with motion sensors on every entry/exit in my apartment, just so I make sure no one was there when I got in at night. One of the first was encountering a man standing in my room when I walked in broad daylight. I had stuff go missing the week before, and my roommate said he had the sense he was being watched in there that week. So I'm on my way home from a night out, and I start going through my phone. I see I have a message on Tinder, and check it out. The girl looks attractive, but I think she's a catfish because she sounds so eager to meet me, and I know that when something sounds too good to be true, it always is. So I get home and she sends me her address. I check it, and she's literally a 5-minute walk. I'm drunk, and it sounds appealing, even just the attention, but again, I don't believe her. So I say video call me, and she surprisingly agrees. I see the call coming in, and I'm not sure what to expect, but surprisingly it's the person. She seems nice. She says she's high and wants to smoke and have some company, and I agree. Now I'm excited. Maybe I'll actually really hit it off with her, and she lives a stone throw away. So I have a shower, grab some liquor, and head over. So I'm on the way, I'm walking. As I'm nearing her place, I look across the street and through this archway that leads into the courtyard for this apartment block. At the end of the arched corridor, I see a man glance out at me, then pretend to look at his phone. I walk past, and I don't know why, but I'm sure it's to do with the paranoia I have been experiencing, but I stop and decide to walk back. As I come to the arch again, I see the guy's head peek out around the corner, and on making eye contact, he jets back rapidly. When I'm in full view of the arched tunnel again, the man is seemingly immersed in his phone again, and he starts walking around the corner and down the street. I stand there and look to see if he will look back. He doesn't, and I hear a girl's voice behind me. It's the girl, and she's like, "Hey, come on in." It feels like an episode of To Catch a Predator, but she's clearly in her early 30s, so I start to relax again, but only briefly. We walk up a flight of steps to get apartment, but then she starts veering down a flight of steps and tells me she has a basement apartment. I follow her and am calm until I get into the living room. I don't know how to describe why. There was nothing there to make me feel nervous, but that was exactly it. It was so bare, just a sofa and a kitchen table, just the complete opposite of what I imagined. I've dated girls, and it just wasn't a girl's apartment. I don't know if that makes sense. So now she's like, "Come into my room," and I get this overwhelming sense of fear, like something telling me it's a trap. Don't do it. You're walking into a honey trap. But I tell myself I'm being paranoid and try to relax again. So I follow her to her room, and it's a tiny box room. There's a bed and an empty bedside drawer. Now the thing that weirds me out the most is, there's another door, which I can only assume leads to a bathroom. The door is closed, but there's a very obvious pool of water coming out from underneath the door, like something had overflowed but stopped. I'm about to ask, but I don't, as her hand cups and squeezes my crotch area, and I'm taken aback at how forward she starts to become. She kisses me while guiding my hand down the front of her sweats inside her underwear, and whispers for me to take my clothes off. I start to open my shirt, and before I can, she is but naked. She sits on the bed and starts opening and getting my pants down straight in to giving me head. Sorry about the details, but I'm trying to explain one. Her over-eagerness to get me naked, and two, the overwhelming feeling she was trying to distract me or put me in a vulnerable position. Now she starts to lie back and pull me on top of her, kissing me and making over-the-top moaning noises. Then, I can distinctly hear something outside the door in the living room, that sound of like clothes rubbing against clothes when you're moving in a really quiet place, and footsteps, not many but like someone is sneaking around. As we're kissing, she tells me my watch is catching her skin, and could I take it off? I find this strange, but it gives me a chance to gather myself. I sit up and start to take it off. I ask her why there's water leaking out of the restroom. I don't know genuinely if she misheard me or was completely sidestepping my question, but she just answers yes, I've water here, and grabs a bottle of water from the side of the bed. I don't re-question. I open the bottle and take a sip. I hear that clothes on clothes light footsteps movement again. I can feel there is someone right outside the door, and my heart starts to beat. I can also feel my lips starting to burn inexplicably. I think she can feel my uneasiness, and starts to kiss the back of my neck, whispering for me to fuck her. Now I can't tell you how much I wanted this to be real, not a setup, to believe this girl really wanted me, but even if she did really like me, she was way too eager. I say, what time is it, and grab my phone. I look at the message where she told me her address, and I memorize it. I open it and go to WhatsApp. I pretend to send an audio message. Hi. Hey guys, I'm at 123 Street, basement apartment. I can see the wide-eyed surprised look on her face. I need one of you to come pick me up outside right away. I can't explain right now, but if you can't come, send someone to that apartment. If I'm not outside, then I'm in trouble, and call the cops. She pauses, stuck for words, and asks why I'm so paranoid. I ask her who's outside, and she doesn't deny that anyone is there, just says her friend, no explanation. I start to get dressed. I feel relieved, but also think, am I overthinking this? I say bye, and she see you later, and starts texting on her phone. I open the door. The room is darker than when we went through it first, but I can make out the silhouette of mostly everything. I don't see any other room though, and wonder where the fuck her friend is, or why was there someone in that room. I have the jitters walking through the room. It's only a short trip, but I'm envisioning someone jumping from out of nowhere and bludgeoning me with something. I get to the stairs. I go up. I rush to the door, can't figure out how to open it. I can feel someone coming behind me, up the stairs. My adrenaline has kicked in 100x. It's her. She goes and opens it. I say thank you and I leave. I check my cameras before going to my apartment. No one has triggered them. I sit in the kitchen and wonder, was I being crazy? I go to my room and into bed, and surprisingly get a call from her again, and she's being cool. She tells me stop being so paranoid and come back. Now I'm actually half thinking about it, thinking I've been acting insane, but something just clicks. A theory I had been having that would make sense of this. I tell her and can't. She asks why, and I tell her that my roommate is on the phone to the cops. To stay the fuck away, I've cameras everywhere. She pauses and then says, which still gives me the creeps, I know your roommate isn't home from work yet, and hangs up. So the weeks before this, as I explained, I had a few attempted break-ins. I always thought the roof, because I'm on it top floor, but the cameras never caught anything. What I didn't understand was how they were getting in. The apartment next door to me, the only other one on that floor, was occupied by the landlord's brother. He has what I'm guessing is dementia or something similar. He kind of hoards and takes random things in and out every so often. I hadn't seen him in a while, but had heard movement in the apartment. I knew what was happening, it just all clicked. People were coming down the fire escape and in his window. I think possibly staying there, stealing from him, using my Wi-Fi as I had the code left on the wall. I think that night they decided to rob me, knowing my roommate wouldn't be home until 4 at least, and someone watching me while I was out in the neighborhood. When they realized I was going home early, they tried to distract me. I told the landlord I thought people were going through the apartment. I don't know with the clutter in there, could you tell, but I know the window was unlocked, and he stayed with an elderly lady on the second floor who looks after him. There hasn't been much activity since, so I hope this is the end of it. I didn't call the police because I wasn't sure if I was being crazy, but I knew deep down I wasn't. But even when I tell people, I can see they're like, okay. When I turned 17 last year, me and 2 other friends had a little get-together and kind of planned to go out that night. One of my friends was active on Tinder and had been chatting with an 18-years-old guy named Jens. This guy asks if we'd come and meet him at this bar in Utrecht, the Netherlands. And we're thinking, OMG, free alcohol with a hot guy seems fun. We get ready, take a train, and within 15 minutes we're in Utrecht. We stopped at some stores and a restaurant before we got to the bar. We go in and sit on those high chairs. We didn't see the guy from the Tinder profile, so we waited. Then my friend got the message that he was delayed. So we waited, we ordered some cokes. My friend tried to message the guy again, but the messages went unanswered. After a while, this man, who had also been sitting at the bar the whole time, asked us if he could offer us a drink. This man was maybe 30 years old, but there were 3 of us, and after all we came to get a free drink, so we said yes, and he ordered us shots. We continued our conversation, and when we finished the shots, he'd get us new ones. Then at some point he came to sit with us and engaged with our conversation. Then later all of us moved to a lounge in the corner in the bar. We were all kind of tipsy and enjoying ourselves. That kind of went on, like for example we talked about our favorite artists, but then he started asking sexually tinted questions, and because this man was not hot at all, rather ugly, and way too old, we did not like that. I felt a little too tipsy and needed some water, so I got up to ask for water at the bar. When I did, the waitress at the bar told me that we could absolutely not go home with this man we were sitting with. Because she said that at their bar it had happened that a young girl would come and sit at the bar, get stood up, and then this supposedly nice man, who always happened to be there when a girl got stood up, would buy them a drink, get them a drunk, and ask them to go home with him. And that's the guy we were sitting with. I did not make a connection right away, but I understood this man was not as nice as he seemed. When I got back to our table, I said to my friends I wanted to go home, and they agreed. We were trying to say goodbye, but the guy kept pressuring us have another drink or go to another bar. He said he had Bacardi for us at his home, and asked if we wanted to get it. He kept pressuring and literally walked with us out of the bar. I freaked out and thought he man was going to follow us home. But eventually he did walk into another bar, and we went ahead and took our train back home. The next day I realized what had happened. I told my friends what the waitress said, and when my friend tried to contact the Tinder profile, she found out that he blocked her. I am 100% sure that the 30-year-old man, who coincidentally was there to get friendly with us when we got stood up, was actually the 19-year-old that we were supposed to meet up with. I think about what could have happened if we were to have gone with him to his home. And I'm so happy there were three of us, like what could have happened if I were alone. For every young girl in the Netherlands out there, if you stumble across a Tinder account under the name Jens, don't be too quick to meet them. I believe he lives in Utrecht City, as he asked us to walk with him for the Bacardi. If you happen to be stood up, and a white, about 30-year-old man with short dark blonde hair and uneven eyebrows offers you drinks, don't accept and leave. The restaurant buzzed with the warm chatter of other diners, their voices blending with the clinking of silverware and the soft hum of background music. I sat stiffly at the table, trying to steady my nerves. It had been a long time since I'd been on a date. Too long, thanks to the emotional wreckage of a 3-year relationship that had ended in flames. But here I was, determined to try again, pushing myself to embrace the terrifying world of dating. For 2 weeks, I'd been talking to this guy. On paper, he seemed great, funny, charming, and no glaring red flags. Our conversations had been light, easy, the kind that made me think maybe, just maybe, I was ready to move on. When he asked me out to dinner, I said yes, hoping this was the first step towards something good. He arrived a little late, all smiles and confidence as he slid into the booth across from me. The dim lighting cast soft shadows over his face, making him seem almost too perfect. "Sorry I'm late," he said, brushing off the apology with a wink. Traffic was a nightmare. I smiled politely, nerves still fluttering in my chest. The waitress appeared quickly, handing us menus and taking our drink orders. I ordered a soda, eager to keep my head clear, and he ordered some craft beer that he clearly thought was impressive. We started chatting, the kind of awkward small talk that felt like trudging through knee-deep mud, but I figured that was normal for a first date. Then, somewhere in the middle of explaining why I hadn't been out much lately, I said, "I've been saving up for a washer and dryer. Mine broke a while ago, and I've been trying to budget for replacements." He leaned back in his chair, smirking like he knew something I didn't. "You know," he said, his voice casual but laced with something sharp, "instead of saving for that, you should save for a boob job." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My brain froze, the words hanging in the air between us like a bad joke waiting for a punchline. But the punchline never came. He was dead serious. I stared at him, stunned into silence. My stomach churned, and my cheeks flushed with embarrassment and anger. Before I could even figure out how to respond, he doubled down. No, it's not a bad thing," he said, waving a hand as if he was doing me a favor. "My sister and mom both had small tits, and they got boob jobs. They look amazing now." I blinked, my mind reeling. Did he really just say that? To me? On a first date? Before we even had our drinks? My throat tightened, a lump of indignation forming as I tried to comprehend the sheer audacity. He just sat there, looking at me like he'd offered sage advice, like he expected me to thank him for his thoughtful suggestion. I glanced around the restaurant, suddenly hyper-aware of every other table. Couples laughed, groups clinked glasses, and servers wove between tables, oblivious to the humiliation burning through me. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue or demand an explanation. I just stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing a few curious glances from nearby diners, but I didn't care. Let them stare. Let him sit there and wonder what he'd done wrong. The cold night air hit me like a slap, a welcome contrast to the suffocating heat of the restaurant. I kept walking, my heels clicking against the pavement, adrenaline surging through my veins. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, the part that had been worn down by heartbreak and self-doubt. By the time I reached my car, the initial shock had faded, replaced by a simmering anger. How dare he? How dare anyone think they could comment on my body like that, as if it was their right to decide what I should or shouldn't change. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. The absurdity of it all hit me then, and I laughed, sharp and bitter, but a laugh nonetheless. This wasn't the start of a love story, but maybe it was the start of something better. A reminder that I didn't have to settle, didn't have to endure thoughtless comments or gross entitlement just to feel wanted. The theater was buzzing with excitement that night, the kind of electric energy that only comes from the premiere of a blockbuster movie. I'd been looking forward to this for weeks, a first date with someone who seemed genuinely interesting. Star Wars: The Force Awakens was the film, a perfect excuse for shared popcorn and whispered commentary during the action-packed scenes. At least, that's how I'd imagined it. What I didn't imagine was the surprise waiting for me when I arrived. She was standing by the ticket counter, but she wasn't alone. Beside her was another girl, grinning awkwardly. "This is my sister," my date said casually, as though it was the most natural thing in the world to bring a chaperone to a first date. I blinked, unsure how to respond. My gut told me something was off, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they were close, maybe it was last minute. Play it cool, I told myself. What's the worst that could happen? The worst started with the tickets. Somehow, I ended up pulling out my wallet and paying for all three of us. I can't even recall how it happened. It just did. Maybe it was her charm, or maybe it was the fact that old me couldn't handle confrontation. Either way, I found myself standing in line with a sinking feeling, clutching tickets for a movie I suddenly wasn't excited about anymore. As we settled into our seats, the situation only got worse. The lights dimmed, the iconic Star Wars crawl began, and I glanced over at them, eager to share in the moment. But they both looked utterly lost. "So who's that guy?" her sister whispered loudly, pointing at the screen. "Wait, what's the deal with the gold robot?" my date chimed in. It hit me then. They had never seen a Star Wars movie before. Not one. I stared ahead, trying to suppress my frustration as they whispered back and forth, their confusion breaking any chance of getting lost in the movie. Every twist, every reveal, every callback to the originals, none of it landed for them. Meanwhile, I sat there, acutely aware of how much I'd been looking forward to this moment, and how completely derailed it had become. When the credits finally rolled, I sighed in relief, ready to head home and call it a night. But no, the evening wasn't over yet. They wanted McDonald's. We piled into the fast food joint, the smell of fries and grease filling the air. I grabbed something small, a drink maybe, and watched as my date ordered fries. Just fries. Her sister ordered a full meal, of course. They sat across from me, chatting away like I wasn't even there. For over an hour, I sat in that fluorescent-lit purgatory, nursing my drink and watching her eat fries one at a time. Meanwhile, her sister took center stage, launching into an unfiltered tirade about everyone at her job. Co-workers, managers, even customers. No one was safe from her sharp, biting commentary. Every time I tried to shift the conversation, to steer it towards something even remotely date-like, she'd interrupt, dragging the focus back to her ongoing workplace drama. I glanced at my date more than once, hoping for some sign of acknowledgement, some spark of connection that might salvage the night. But she seemed content to let her sister dominate the conversation, occasionally nodding along or throwing in the odd comment. By the time I finally made it to my car, my head was spinning. What had just happened? Was this a date? A family outing? Some kind of elaborate prank? The whole experience felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into someone else's bizarre evening and been forced to play along. There was no second date, not even an attempt. She didn't reach out, and neither did I. To this day, I still think about that night from time to time, trying to make sense of it. Was it a test? A joke? Or just a glaring incompatibility that became painfully obvious over a tray of cold fries? I may not have gotten answers, but I walked away with one valuable lesson. If someone brings an unexpected guest to a first date, it's a red flag the size of a Star Destroyer. And next time, I'd be paying for only one ticket, mine. A notification from Tinder. I checked it, my pulse quickening out of habit. A match had messaged me. Her profile had caught my eye earlier. Sharp wit in her bio, a mischievous glint in her photos. I'd been hopeful. Hey, what's up? I typed back, keeping it simple, not wanting to overthink it. Her response came almost immediately, but it wasn't anything I could have anticipated. Don't talk to me unless you plan on. Well, unless you meet certain standards. I froze, rereading the message. The tone wasn't playful or flirtatious. It was brash, over the top, and left no room for conversation. I sat there, unsure whether to laugh or roll my eyes. I replied with something. What? I can't even remember now. But whatever it was, it didn't matter. She didn't respond, and I let it go, chalking it up to one of those bizarre online interactions everyone warns you about. A week passed, and the strange encounter faded from my mind. Life went on as usual, classes, work, and the occasional late-night fast food run. That night, my stomach growled after hours of cramming for an exam, so I decided to grab something quick. McDonald's seemed like the easiest option. The place was buzzing with its usual hum of activity, the fluorescent lights casting an odd glow over everything. I stepped into the line, placed my order, and shuffled to the counter to wait. My thoughts drifted, half focused on a class project due next week, when the employee behind the counter called my number. I stepped forward, not thinking much of it, but the moment she handed me my bag, the air shifted. Our eyes met, and time seemed to freeze. It was her, the girl from Tinder. Recognition flickered in her eyes first, and it was instant. Her expression shifted rapidly, a flash of disbelief followed by something closer to fear. She looked at me like I was the villain in some terrible drama, her hands visibly trembling as she held out my bag of food. For a split second, I was too stunned to react. Then the realization hit me like a wave. She thought I'd come here intentionally, that I'd tracked her down to confront her over that ridiculous message. The awkwardness in the air was suffocating, an invisible wall of tension that seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. I wanted to say something, to clear up the misunderstanding, but my brain refused to cooperate. What could I possibly say? Hey, I didn't know you worked here, and this is purely a coincidence. That sounded almost worse, like an excuse someone would give when caught red-handed. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me, as if gauging the fastest escape route. I could feel the weight of her co-workers' curious glances, though none of them seemed to realize what was happening. My face burned with embarrassment. This wasn't just awkward, it was surreal. Finally, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the bag, muttered a quick, thanks, and walked out as fast as my legs would carry me. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with every step. I didn't look back, didn't dare risk seeing her reaction again. The cool night air hit me like a bomb as I stepped outside, but the tension in my chest didn't ease until I was halfway to my car. Sitting behind the wheel, I let out a shaky breath and shook my head, replaying the scene in my mind. What were the odds of something like this happening? It felt like the universe had decided to turn my life into some twisted comedy sketch. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the image of her face, wide-eyed, pale, filled with fear. She probably thought I was some kind of stalker, and the thought made me cringe. In reality, I barely remembered the interaction until now. The whole thing had been ridiculous from start to finish. A bizarre encounter that I wouldn't have believed if it hadn't happened to me. The next day, I deleted Tinder. Maybe I'd try again someday, but for now, I'd had enough of awkward dates and strange online encounters. Some lessons, I realized, don't need repeating. So in my late 20s, I was using dating apps to meet people. I'd been on Bumble and Tinder, but this time I was trying OkCupid because my best friend swore she had met her boyfriend on there, and they seemed happy. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to hang out with, maybe go on a few dates. One night, I got a message from a guy named Ethan. His profile was sparse, no pictures, just a vague description about liking books and hiking. Normally, I'd swipe left on someone like that, but his message caught my attention. It wasn't the usual hey or what's up. Instead, it was a long, thoughtful paragraph about how he'd read one of my favorite books that I'd mentioned on my profile and found it fascinating. He asked me a really specific question about it, which made me think he wasn't just copy-pasting the same message to everyone. I replied, and we started talking. He was smart, like really smart, the kind of person who could make you feel interesting just by the way they responded to you. He had this dry, sarcastic sense of humor that I love, and our conversations flowed effortlessly. We talked about everything: movies, music, childhood memories, even our worst fears. The only thing that felt off was that he never sent me a picture of himself, even after I asked. He said he was camera shy and didn't like the way he looked in photos, but he assured me he wasn't a weirdo or anything. I should have stopped talking to him. I know that now. But at the time, I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. He seemed so genuine, and I didn't want to come across as shallow. After about a week of messaging, he asked if I wanted to meet in person. He said he knew a great little coffee shop downtown, somewhere quiet where we could talk. I was hesitant, but eventually I agreed. I figured worst case, if he turned out to be super weird or looked nothing like he claimed, I could just leave. I told my roommate where I was going and gave her the name of the coffee shop, just to be safe. The day of the date, I got to the coffee shop early. It was a small place, tucked into the corner of a strip mall. The kind of spot where you'd expect to see students studying or couples on their third date. But when I walked in, it was empty. No baristas, no customers, just the faint smell of coffee and a low hum from the fridge in the corner. I double-checked the time and the address Ethan had sent me. I was in the right place. Maybe I was just early. I grabbed a seat by the window and waited. About 5 minutes later, the door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, and he kept his head down as he approached me. For a second, I thought maybe it was him, but then he just brushed past me and went to sit in the corner, facing the wall. Weird, but whatever. I kept waiting. Another 10 minutes passed, and Ethan still hadn't shown up. I was starting to get annoyed when I got a text from him. "Are you here?" it said. "Yeah," I replied. "I'm by the window." "Where are you?" No response. I looked around the room again, and that's when I noticed something strange. The guy in the hoodie, he was turned slightly now, just enough that I could see his face. He wasn't looking at me, but he was holding his phone in his hand, typing something. My stomach twisted. Almost immediately, I got another text from Ethan. "You look exactly like I imagined." My heart stopped. I glanced down at my phone, then back at the guy in the hoodie. His head was still tilted down, but I could feel his eyes flicking toward me, watching from beneath the hood. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Still, I texted back, "Where are you sitting?" No response. I stood up, pretending to adjust my bag, and casually walked toward the door. The guy in the hoodie didn't move, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. As soon as I was outside, I called my roommate and told her what was happening. "Get in your car and leave," she said immediately. Now, I didn't need to be told twice. I walked quickly to my car, trying not to look over my shoulder, and locked the doors as soon as I got in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. That's when I got another text. "Why are you leaving? We haven't even talked yet." I looked up, and there he was. The guy in the hoodie was standing in the doorway of the coffee shop, staring at me. His hood was still up, and I couldn't see his expression, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. He didn't move, didn't try to come closer, just stood there watching. I floored it out of the parking lot and didn't stop driving until I was back home. When I got there, I blocked Ethan's number and deleted OkCupid. I spent the rest of the night replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out how I'd been so stupid. The next morning, I told my roommate everything. She convinced me to file a police report, just in case. The officer I spoke to was polite, but didn't seem too concerned. He said it was probably just a guy trying to mess with me, and that I'd done the right thing by leaving. But here's the part that still makes my skin crawl. A couple of weeks later, I was scrolling through the news when I saw a headline about a man who'd been arrested for stalking and attempted kidnapping. His mugshot was attached to the article, and my stomach dropped. It was him, the guy from the coffee shop, the man with the hoodie. Apparently, he'd been using fake profiles on dating apps to lure women to isolated places. One of his victims had managed to escape and report him, which led to his arrest. The police found duct tape, rope, and a knife in the trunk of his car. The dim glow of my phone's screen lit up my dorm room as I scrolled through Tinder late one night, bored out of my mind and half-heartedly swiping. It was a typical college evening, homework pushed to the side, social life creeping into the foreground. Then I saw her. She was older than me by a year or two, a junior or senior at the same university, with a smile that radiated confidence and an energy that felt magnetic even through her profile photos. A match came almost immediately, followed by her first message. Fast forward a few days, and I was at her apartment for our first hangout. The vibe was relaxed, nothing too intense, just Netflix and casual conversation. I thought she was amazing, down to earth, funny, and way out of my league. As I left that night, I found myself hoping this could turn into something real. When I told her I'd like to see her again, her reply was enthusiastic. "I'd love that. Just hit me up whenever." The week that followed was a flurry of texts and Snapchats. It felt exciting, like the kind of connection you don't stumble upon often. Then, out of the blue, she sent me a nude. I was startled, not because I didn't find her attractive, she was stunning, but because it was so unexpected. We hadn't crossed any lines during our first hangout. It had been completely platonic. Yet here she was, sending me pictures that left no room for ambiguity. I was a young guy, and this confident older girl was showing me attention I hadn't even asked for. I won't lie, I was flattered. And of course, I didn't object. The messages escalated over the week, and by the time we planned to meet again, I had no doubt where things were heading. That Saturday, she came over to my place. My roommates and I were lounging in the living room watching TV, and she seamlessly fit into the dynamic, laughing and chatting like she'd been part of the group for years. At one point, she leaned over and asked if she could stay the night. My brain went into overdrive. After everything she'd been sending me all week, I knew what she meant. Trying to be polite, I offered to sleep on the couch, but she shot that down quickly. "I'd rather you sleep in your bed with me," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was clear, this was happening. We retreated to my room, and one thing led to another. We hooked up, and afterward, we lay side by side in the hazy quiet that follows, the kind where you're not sure whether to break the silence or just let it linger. I'd tossed the used condom to the floor beside the bed, not thinking much of it in the moment. Then, out of nowhere, she got up abruptly. I watched as she walked around to my side of the bed and bent down to pick up the condom. My heart sank, confusion gripping me. Without saying a word, she darted into the bathroom and shut the door. A beat passed, then another. I stayed in bed, unsure of what to do. Then I heard a loud crash, followed by her voice muttering a panicked, "Oh no." Alarmed, I called out, "Are you okay?" No response. I hesitated for a moment before walking to the bathroom door. My mind raced with possibilities. Had she slipped? Hurt herself? But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I opened the door. She was standing in my shower, one leg propped up, trying to shove the condom into herself. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what she was doing, flipping the condom inside out and attempting to inseminate herself. I froze, my brain struggling to process the scene unfolding in front of me. Her head snapped toward me, eyes wide with shock. Time seemed to stand still for a second, then everything sped up. I shut the door as quickly as I'd opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. A moment later, she emerged, avoiding my gaze. "I'm gonna leave," she said quickly, grabbing her things. "Sounds good," I replied, my voice hollow. There was nothing else to say. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stood there in stunned silence. My mind replayed the night over and over, searching for answers I'd never get. She never contacted me again, and I didn't reach out either. To this day, that night remains a surreal, unsettling memory, one that reminds me just how unpredictable people can be. I had just joined Match.com, back when online dating was still a novelty and mostly populated by people desperate enough to take a chance on the unknown. I didn't have high hopes, but when her profile popped up, everything changed. She was stunning, out of my league stunning. The kind of beauty that made you double-check to see if it was some kind of catfish situation. But it wasn't. She responded to my message, and soon we were planning a date. When I met her in person, I felt like I was walking on air. She was even more gorgeous than her photos, all confidence and charm wrapped up in a perfectly tailored outfit. To my shock, the date was going well. Better than well. We were laughing, talking like we'd known each other forever, and by the time the first drinks were finished, we'd already stolen a kiss in the corner of the restaurant. I couldn't believe my luck. This kind of thing didn't happen to me. Not to me. So when she suggested we keep the night going and head to a bar nearby, I didn't hesitate. If anything, I was eager to stretch out the magic as long as possible. The bar was dimly lit, cozy, with a warm hum of conversation filling the air. We found a quiet corner, tucked away from the crowd, and settled in with our drinks. She leaned in close, her hand brushing mine, her laugh lighting up the room. I couldn't stop marveling at the surreal turn my night had taken. And then the door opened. A group of young African men walked in, laughing and talking among themselves. It was unusual, I'll admit. Our town was small and predominantly white, the kind of place where seeing people of different ethnicities stood out more than it should have. But it was no big deal, or at least it shouldn't have been. That's when she stood up. At first, I thought maybe she was going to the restroom or getting another drink. But instead, she turned toward the group and began shouting. Loudly, "You don't belong here," she yelled, her voice cutting through the chatter in the bar like a knife. "Go back to where you came from." The words hit me like a freight train, and the air seemed to leave the room. She wasn't done. She kept going, dropping slurs, including that word, over and over. The group of men froze, exchanging incredulous looks, their laughter replaced with stunned silence. The entire bar turned to watch the scene unfold, a mixture of disbelief and unease rippling through the crowd. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, the kind where the camera zooms in on the protagonist's horrified face, while the world around them spins into chaos. My mind raced, every cell in my body screaming, "What is happening right now?" I stared at her, my chest tightening with a sickening realization. This person, this gorgeous, seemingly perfect person, was nothing like the woman I thought I'd spent the evening with. My skin crawled as the shock melted into shame, embarrassment, and anger. I couldn't sit there a second longer. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked straight out the door without looking back. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it did little to cool the fire of emotions raging inside me. She didn't follow me. At least, not immediately. The next day, my phone buzzed with a message from her. She wanted to meet up again. Another date. Like nothing had happened. I didn't reply. There was no explanation she could offer, no excuse I could stomach. Some things you just can't unsee, and her actions were one of them. Too good to be true. That's what the whole night had been. A cruel, twisted reminder that appearances don't mean a thing when the person behind them is rotten to the core. For days, I replayed the night in my head, wondering how I could have missed the signs, if there even were any. But the truth was, I hadn't missed anything. She'd hidden it well, the way people often do with their worst traits, until the right moment brought it to the surface. The gamer bar was alive with the hum of arcade machines and the clatter of controllers, a place where neon lights bounced off walls plastered with pixelated murals. It was my kind of scene, nostalgic, geeky, and laid back. Tonight, it was also the setting for my first date with someone who seemed promising. We'd bonded over mutual nerdy interests and swapped witty banter through text messages, the kind of conversations that made me hopeful this might actually be different. When he walked in, he looked just like his profile photos, a little scruffy, glasses perched on his nose, and wearing a t-shirt with some obscure gaming reference that I immediately recognized. I waved, and he came over, smiling warmly. The moment he opened his mouth to greet me, however, my stomach dropped. He had no teeth. None. I struggled to mask my shock, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't something small or superficial. It was a glaring detail, one that had been carefully hidden during our chats and video calls. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. He probably had a good reason for it, right? Maybe an accident or a medical condition. I forced a smile and pushed the thought aside as we sat down. The conversation started smoothly enough. He was just as funny and smart as he'd seemed online, throwing out clever quips and sharing anecdotes about his favorite games. But soon he leaned in, lowering his voice as if he were about to share a secret. "So," he began, glancing around before continuing, "I don't know if you noticed." I blinked, trying not to look directly at his gums as he spoke. "Noticed what?" I asked, feigning ignorance. He gestured vaguely toward his face. "The teeth thing." It was impossible to ignore now. He launched into an explanation about a hack dentist who had convinced him all his teeth needed to be removed. Then came the horror story of budget constraints that prevented him from getting dentures, and the grim detail that he had to wait for bone shards to fall out of his gums before he could even consider replacements. I listened, nodding along sympathetically. It was a tragic story, and I genuinely felt bad for him. But as he spoke, it became clear that he was completely unfazed by the situation. He joked about it, brushing off any discomfort it might cause, both for himself and for me. And then the food arrived. As he talked, particles of his meal sprayed from his mouth, landing on the shared basket of fries between us. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but each fleck of food was a tiny jab at my appetite. It wasn't his fault, of course, he couldn't help it, but the visual was too much to ignore. I found myself retreating inward, my thoughts spiraling. If he'd hidden something this monumental from me, what else might he be keeping secret? Trust was the cornerstone of any relationship, and this omission felt like a crack in the foundation before we'd even started building anything. He, meanwhile, was oblivious to my growing discomfort, continuing to talk enthusiastically about his favorite games and the tabletop campaigns he'd been running. Normally, I'd have been thrilled to dive into those topics, but my focus kept shifting back to the reality of the situation. As the evening wore on, I realized something else. I couldn't get past the thought of intimacy with someone who had no teeth. I felt shallow for even thinking it, but the idea of kissing him made my stomach churn. I kept imagining the texture, the sensation, and it was enough to make me push my food away entirely. When the check came, I politely suggested we call it a night. He smiled, seemingly unaware of my internal struggle, and thanked me for such a fun time. I smiled back, hoping it didn't look forced, and we went our separate ways. On the drive home, I replayed the evening in my mind. It wasn't just the teeth, it was the way he'd hidden it, the way he assumed it wouldn't matter. Maybe it didn't to some people, but to me, it was a breach of trust one couldn't overlook. The next day, when he texted to ask about a second date, I let him down gently. He was a good guy, but I knew deep down that this wasn't something I could move past. Some things, no matter how trivial they might seem, are just too big to ignore. She'd seemed like a great match on Tinder. Smart, edgy, with a sense of humor that bordered on irreverent but never crossed into outright bizarre. At least, that's what I thought. She walked in, dressed to impress, exuding confidence. I stood up to greet her, trying to hide my nervous energy. From the outset, she seemed exactly as I'd imagined, funny, engaging, and full of sharp wit. Over appetizers, we talked about everything from school to movies to our shared love of obscure music. It felt easy, natural, until it didn't. The shift came gradually, subtle at first. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, and asked if I'd ever had a truly wild relationship. I laughed awkwardly, unsure of what she meant, and said something vague about not being the adventurous type. That's when the conversation took a turn I hadn't seen coming. You know, she began, stirring her drink absently, I've been thinking a lot about my ex-husband lately. The mention of an ex wasn't unusual. Everyone has a past, but the way she said it made my skin prickle. Oh, I said cautiously, unsure of where this was going. She smiled, a strange glint in her eye. I was thinking, if we hook up tonight, maybe we could record it, for fun. And then I could send it to him. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. I froze, unsure if I'd misheard her. You'd send it to your ex? I asked, my voice faltering. Yeah, she said, completely nonchalant. He'd lose his mind. It'd be hilarious. I forced a laugh, trying to mask my discomfort, but my mind was already spinning. This wasn't just a red flag, it was an entire parade of them. I reached for my water, stalling for time, trying to decide if I should cut the date short right then and there. But before I could think of an excuse to leave, she took the conversation to an even darker place. You know what I really enjoy? She asked, her tone suddenly serious. I looked up, hesitant to answer. What's that? I like being hit, she said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing a favorite hobby. And my favorite kind of sex is safe word rape. I didn't even know how to respond. My brain stalled, caught between disbelief and an overwhelming urge to get as far away as possible. She smiled as if she'd just shared a fun little secret, completely oblivious to the wave of unease washing over me. I set my fork down, my appetite gone. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming at full volume. This wasn't a casual quirk or a harmless eccentricity. This was something far darker, something I couldn't begin to untangle. I don't think I'm really your type, I managed to say, my voice shaking slightly. Maybe we should call it a night. Her expression barely faltered. She shrugged, as if she'd expected this reaction, and went back to sipping her drink. Suit yourself, she said, completely unfazed. I signaled for the check, paid for the meal without looking at her, and left the restaurant as quickly as I could without outright sprinting. The cool night air hit me like a wave, but it did little to calm my racing heart. I walked back to my car in a daze, replaying the conversation in my mind, each word more surreal than the last. When I got home, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone. Tinder was still open, her profile staring back at me, a stark reminder of how far off the rails things had gone. Without hesitation, I deleted the app, erasing it from my phone like I was scrubbing away the memory of the night. That date wasn't just a bad experience, it was a wake-up call. I'd gone looking for connection, something light and fun to break the monotony of college life. Instead, I'd found a dark corner of the dating world I hadn't been prepared for. Some people's stories aren't meant to intertwine, and hers was one I was more than happy to leave behind. Her name was Danny, and we met on her, a dating app for queer women, about 2 months ago. She was gorgeous in a bold, effortless way, with these striking green eyes and short-cropped black hair that matched her sharp, sarcastic sense of humor. Her profile was filled with cheeky quips and pictures of her hiking, reading, and once, oddly, wielding an axe at a lumberjack competition. I joked about it in my opening message, something like, "Are you chopping wood or murdering exes?" She replied, "Wouldn't you like to know?" with a winking emoji. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. We hit it off right away. Our chats were full of banter, deep conversations about life, and shared playlists that felt like little love letters. After a week of texting and a late-night FaceTime that turned into both of us falling asleep on the call, we decided to meet up. Danny suggested a cute little wine bar downtown, and I was nervous but excited. In person, she was even more magnetic. The green eyes, the confidence, the way she made you feel like the only person in the room. She had this edge to her, this aura of mystery, but I found it intoxicating rather than alarming. She confessed she'd just moved to the city a few months ago and was still figuring stuff out. I didn't pry into her past. It felt too soon, and honestly, I was too caught up in the moment. One date turned into 2, then 3, and before long, we were spending a lot of time together. Danny wasn't one to overshare, but she'd drop little details about her life here and there. How she'd grown up in a small, rough town, how she didn't have much family left, how she'd had to reinvent herself a few times over the years. It all added to her mysterious allure. She was a little guarded, sure, but I didn't mind. Everyone has their walls. The intimacy between us grew quickly. She was attentive, affectionate, and had this way of making me feel utterly seen. One night, after a dinner at her place, where she cooked this incredible pasta dish from scratch, we ended up on her couch, tipsy and tangled in each other. It was the kind of night that felt like it could stretch on forever, soft and warm and perfect. But then, I saw it. We were lying in bed, her arm draped lazily over me, when my fingers brushed against her forearm. Her shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing a tattoo I hadn't noticed before. It was faint, like it had been partially removed, but still legible enough to make my stomach drop. It was a name, Melissa. Beneath it, there was a date, August 14th, 2015, and a small, crude drawing of a dagger. I froze. My mind raced. Who was Melissa? Why was her name connected to a dagger? And why did Danny seem like she didn't want anyone to see it? I must have gone quiet for too long because Danny shifted beside me, her green eyes flicking open. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly from sleep. "Oh, nothing," I said quickly, pulling my hand back. "I just noticed your tattoo." Her eyes followed my gaze to her arm, and for the briefest second, I saw something in her expression. It wasn't embarrassment or annoyance, it was fear. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by her usual confident smirk. "Oh, that? It's ancient. A stupid thing I got when I was younger." "Who's Melissa?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, casual, but my heart was pounding. Danny sat up slightly, pulling her arm away and tugging her sleeve down. "Just someone I used to know," she said, avoiding my eyes. "It's not a big deal." The way she said it made it clear she didn't want to talk about it. I nodded, pretending to drop it, but my curiosity and unease was gnawing at me. Why would she get someone's name tattooed on her arm with a dagger? It didn't feel like a tribute. It felt sinister. The next day, while Danny was at work, I couldn't stop thinking about the tattoo. I didn't want to spiral, but something about it was sticking in my brain like a splinter. I decided to do some light Googling. Just to ease my mind, I told myself. I searched Melissa August 14th, 2015, along with the name of the town Danny had mentioned she'd grown up in. What I found made my blood run cold. It was a news article, dated August 15th, 2015. The headline read, "Local woman found dead in brutal stabbing." My hands were shaking as I clicked on it. The article was short, but the details were horrifying. Melissa Parker, 25, had been found in her apartment, stabbed multiple times. Police suspected foul play, but had no solid leads at the time. A follow-up article from years later said the case had gone cold. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The date matched. The name matched. And the tattoo, it suddenly felt less like a memory and more like a confession. I tried to push it aside. There was no way Danny was involved. She couldn't be. She was kind and funny, and no, it didn't fit. But the thought wouldn't leave me alone. That night, when we met up again, I couldn't stop looking at her differently. Every little joke, every casual smile, it all felt like a mask. I was jumpy, distracted, and Danny noticed. "Hey," she said, tilting her head. "What's going on with you tonight? You've been weird since you got here." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. "Come on," she said, leaning in closer. "You can tell me." I wanted to. I wanted to ask her outright about Melissa, about the tattoo, about the articles I'd found. But I couldn't. Something in her gaze stopped me. It wasn't threatening, exactly, but there was an intensity there that made my stomach twist. "Nothing," I said again, forcing a smile. "Seriously." For the rest of the night, I played along, pretending everything was fine. But as soon as I got home, I blocked her number and deleted the app. I couldn't face her again. I didn't want to know the truth. A week later, I got a message on Instagram. It was from an account with no profile picture, but I knew it was Danny. The message just said, "You didn't have to ghost me. I thought we had something real." The first time my mom told me she was joining Tinder, I nearly spit out my coffee. It wasn't that I was against it. In fact, I was all for her stepping into a new chapter after enduring decades of an unhappy marriage. It was just unexpected. "Stella's getting her groove back," she declared with a smirk, echoing the title of that old movie. And I, as her adult child, was 100% on her team. If anyone deserved a little adventure, it was her. From the start, she made it clear, this wasn't about finding a long-term relationship. No romance, no strings, just a bit of fun while she was on a work trip out of state. It sounded harmless enough. She started sending me screenshots of potential matches, asking for my opinions. It was surreal, sitting in my tiny college apartment, playing wingman to my own mom. "Not this guy," I'd text back. "His bio screams midlife crisis." Or, "Swipe left. He's holding a fish. You hate fishing." And then she found him. The guy. Her pick for the night. The moment I saw his profile, alarm bells went off. His photos were normal enough, but his bio read like a walking, talking red flag. He seemed too smooth, too eager. The kind of guy who could charm anyone into letting their guard down. "Mom," I texted, "this guy is sketchy." Hard pass. But she laughed it off. "Oh, come on. He's just cute and chatty. What's the worst that could happen?" She was an adult. I couldn't stop her. So, with some last-minute safety reminders from me, "Share your location. Tell me when you're back at the hotel." She went off to meet him. The next morning, I got the text. "Well, that was interesting." She didn't elaborate. Just said they'd hung out for a few hours, and he'd dropped her off. "Nothing serious," she added, which I took as her way of saying it was over. Or so I thought. Later that afternoon, she called me, her voice shaking. "He knows my address." I froze. "What? How?" Apparently, during their brief time together, he'd pieced together enough details about her life, her work, the city she'd flown from, and the general timeline of her trip, to figure out which flight she was taking the next day. From there, he'd tracked down her final destination. Using public tax records, he'd found her full name, which led him to her Facebook profile. It didn't stop there. "He called your dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My stomach dropped. My parents hadn't spoken directly since the divorce. For this stranger to insert himself into their lives, calling my dad and spilling details about my mom's Tinder rendezvous, was beyond invasive. My mom sounded utterly rattled as she recounted the messages he'd sent her afterward, swinging wildly between professions of love and accusations of betrayal. "He sent him pictures," she continued, "and screenshots of our texts. Everything." I was furious, both for her and for myself. This wasn't just about my mom anymore. This man had disrupted our family in the most grotesque way possible. "You need to call the police," I told her. She hesitated, not wanting to escalate things, but I insisted. This wasn't something to brush off. The harassment didn't stop. Over the next few days, he sent her a barrage of messages, alternating between declaring undying love and berating her for being untrustworthy. He demanded explanations, claiming he couldn't trust her even though she'd done nothing wrong. My mom blocked him on everything, Tinder, Facebook, her phone, but he found ways around it, creating new accounts to send her messages. Eventually, she did go to the police. They took her seriously, thankfully, and started the process of filing a restraining order. But the experience left her shaken to her core. For weeks, she couldn't relax, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if he'd show up unannounced. When the dust finally settled, she deleted Tinder and vowed never to touch dating apps again. For me, the whole ordeal was a sobering reminder of how quickly something harmless can spiral into something dangerous. I'd supported her decision to put herself out there, and I still do, but none of us could have predicted how unhinged someone could become after just a few hours of interaction. The sushi restaurant was packed, the kind of night that felt like a blur of clattering dishes, endless orders, and barely contained chaos. I darted between tables, balancing trays of sashimi and miso soup, trying to keep up with the relentless dinner rush. Among the sea of customers, one table stood out, two guys, one of them particularly striking. He had a confident, easy smile and tattoos that crept out from under his sleeves, hinting at stories I'd never hear. Despite the chaos, I made sure they had great service. At the end of their meal, they left a tip so generous it stopped me in my tracks. Later that night, after finally collapsing on my couch, beer in hand, I opened Tinder to mindlessly swipe and decompress. And there he was, the same guy from the restaurant, unmistakable with his sharp features and distinctive ink. My heart skipped a beat. The tip had been memorable, but this? What were the odds? I swiped right and passed out, too tired to overthink it. The next morning, I woke up to a match and a sweet message waiting for me. We started texting, and he was charming, almost disarmingly so. He mentioned he was only in town for business, which should have been my first red flag. But I was intrigued, and he asked me out to dinner at a high-end French restaurant that I could never afford on my own. I hesitated, unsure if I should go. My roommates, fueled by mimosas and bad advice, encouraged me. "What's the harm in a nice dinner?" they said. By that evening, I'd agreed, but things were already off. He insisted on picking me up, pressing harder than anyone should for a first date. My instincts flared, and I told him flat out that I'd cancel if I couldn't drive myself. He backed off, and we arranged to meet at the restaurant. The place was stunning, the kind of place where the lighting is dim, the wine list is longer than a novel, and everyone speaks in hushed tones. He was already seated when I arrived, looking sharp and relaxed. The dinner started well enough. He ordered a $200 bottle of wine, lobster, appetizers, and desserts, sparing no expense. By the time the bill came, I was sure the meal had totaled somewhere close to $600. I couldn't believe someone would spend that kind of money on a first date. As the evening went on, though, the facade started to crack. The more he drank, the more he let slip. Midway through the meal, he casually admitted he was married, but claimed it was an open relationship. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. In response, he pulled out his phone, called his wife, and even sent her a picture of me. To my shock, she sounded excited. "She's gorgeous," I heard her say, her voice tinny over the speaker. "Invite her to Cancun. We'd love to meet her." My stomach churned. He hung up, grinning, and explained that his wife was bisexual and into women. He suggested I join them for a weekend getaway. Red flags piled up faster than I could process. I tried to steer the conversation to safer ground, asking about his work. Without blinking, he told me he was involved with a drug cartel. He spoke about it casually, as if it were just another day at the office. He assured me it was perfectly safe, but my chest tightened. This wasn't the kind of conversation you had on a casual date, or ever. I told him I needed to leave. He followed me out, trailing me to my car, still trying to sell me on the idea of joining him and his wife. He pulled up photos of her on his phone. She was undeniably beautiful, and scrolled through his Instagram, showing off their lavish life in Cancun. "You can trust me," he insisted. "This could be fun." When I still refused, his tone shifted. "I spent all this money on dinner," he said, his voice hardening. "The least you could do is come back to my hotel room." When I backed away, he tried to grab my hand, leaning in for a kiss I wanted no part of. My pulse was pounding as I twisted free and bolted to my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and sped away, checking the rearview mirror constantly. I was terrified he'd follow me home, so I drove aimlessly for an hour before calling a friend. I spent the night at her place, grateful she had male roommates who could make me feel safe. The next morning, I deleted Tinder without hesitation. The more I replayed the night, the darker it felt. Was he just an unhinged rich guy? Or was there something more sinister? Human trafficking, perhaps? I'll never know for sure, but I'm haunted by the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. It was a lesson I'll never forget. Trust your gut, and when the red flags start piling up, don't wait to see how the story ends. My friend, a fellow soldier and someone I'd always known to be tough as nails, leaned forward as we shared stories about strange encounters during a rare night off duty. But when it was her turn, her voice dropped, her expression darkened, and I knew this wasn't just another funny or awkward tale. "This one's different," she started, her tone serious. "It still gets to me, you know?" I nodded, bracing myself. She told me about how it began, a typical modern romance story, or so it seemed. She had been talking to a guy she'd met online, and everything had felt surprisingly normal. He was charming, friendly, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. After a few days of casual conversation, he suggested meeting up for drinks. No red flags, no warning signs, just a simple, seemingly innocent invitation. So she agreed. The bar was a cozy spot, tucked away in one of Norway's quieter neighborhoods. When she arrived, he was already there, smiling and waving her over like an old friend. The first round of drinks came and went, and the conversation flowed easily enough at first. He asked about her life in the military, her travels, and her interests. She started to relax, thinking this might actually turn into a good night. But then the questions began to shift. At first, it was subtle, questions that felt slightly deeper than typical first date fare. "What's the worst memory you have from childhood?" he asked, his eyes locked onto hers in an almost unnerving way. She brushed it off, giving a vague answer and steering the conversation elsewhere. But he didn't let up. "What's your first memory of anything? Intimate?" he asked next, his voice casual, but the question landed like a stone in her stomach. She laughed nervously, trying to dodge the question, but his persistence was unsettling. Every other topic seemed to circle back to something unnervingly personal, even dark. Still, he managed to maintain a facade of charm, keeping her from bolting out the door. When the drinks were finished, he suggested they continue the night at his place. She hesitated, but he seemed harmless enough, a little odd, sure, but not threatening. She agreed. His apartment was small but clean, almost sterile. Too sterile, she thought, but she pushed the thought aside. She excused herself to the bathroom, needing a moment to regroup and shake off the nagging unease creeping up her spine. As she washed her hands, she heard faint noises coming from another room. Curious, and now slightly on edge, she cracked the bathroom door open, careful not to make a sound. She followed the noise to a partially open door down the hall. Inside, she saw him moving around, his back to her. He was spreading thick sheets of plastic over the floor and walls, carefully smoothing out the edges as if preparing for something. The hair on her neck stood up. Her breath hitched, and her mind raced. This wasn't normal. This wasn't safe. She stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and quickly returned to the bathroom. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and panicked. She had to get out. Forcing herself to stay calm, she emerged from the bathroom, putting on her best casual smile. "Hey, I just remembered I've got an early shift tomorrow," she said, grabbing her bag and heading toward the door without waiting for a response. He watched her, his expression unreadable, but didn't try to stop her. She left as quickly as she could without breaking into a run. The moment she was safely outside, she called the police. She didn't expect much to come of it. Maybe they'd check in on him, maybe not. But to her surprise, her call set off a series of events that confirmed her worst fears. The man was already under surveillance for suspicious behavior, and her report gave them the probable cause they needed to search his apartment. What they found turned her stomach. The plastic wasn't for a home renovation project. It was preparation for something far more sinister. Tools, restraints, and other evidence suggested he was on the brink of committing something unthinkable. "I still think about what could have happened if I'd stayed," she told me, her voice heavy with lingering fear. "How close I came to being. I don't even know. Another statistic, maybe." Her story left me cold. It was a chilling reminder of how easily something that feels normal can take a turn into something dark. She's tough, no doubt about it, but even she admitted that night left scars she might never fully shake. The first time I met him, he seemed confident, charming even. He had that air of someone who knows exactly what they want, a quality that, in the right amount, can be magnetic. He planned our first date without much input from me, choosing the restaurant, the time, even the route we took to get there. It felt a little controlling, but I brushed it off. Maybe he's just trying to be chivalrous, I told myself. Some people like to take charge, and maybe he thought I'd appreciate it. That night went fine enough, though something about him kept me slightly on edge. He was polite, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in me, but there was a tension simmering beneath the surface. Little comments he made, subtle digs at how I held my fork or the way I laughed, pricked at me like tiny needles. I ignored them, chalking it up to first date awkwardness. When he asked for a second date, I hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. He suggested we go to London for the evening, saying he'd handle all the details. The vagueness immediately set off alarms in my mind. I tried to be casual about it, asking where in London we were going and what he had planned, but he dodged the question. "It's a surprise," he said with a smug grin, like that would put me at ease. I pressed further, explaining that I needed to know at least a little about where we were going. Mostly for safety, though I didn't say that outright. "I just need to know what to wear," I lied, hoping that would prompt him to share more. His response was strange. "Wear a dress," he said flatly, as though it were an order. I felt my stomach twist. I never wear dresses, they're not my style, and I wasn't about to start now just because someone else told me to. "I don't really do dresses," I replied lightly, trying to keep the mood from souring. "I'll just wear something comfortable." His reaction was immediate and sharp. His tone, which had been playful before, hardened. "Why do you have to be so difficult?" he snapped. "Can't you just go along with it for once?" For once? We'd only met once. I felt my chest tighten. Something about the way he spoke sent a chill down my spine. "I don't think I'm being difficult," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I just want to know where we're going. It's not too much to ask." That's when he lost it. His words spilled out like venom, his face twisting with anger. "You're such a stuck-up bitch," he spat, his voice shaking with frustration. "Always playing games. You're nothing but a cock tease." I froze, my heart pounding as his words sank in. The anger in his voice was startling, the kind that makes your instincts scream at you to get away as fast as possible. This wasn't someone who'd read me wrong or misunderstood my boundaries. This was someone who didn't think they mattered at all. "I don't think this is going to work," I said quietly, already reaching for my phone. "You're out of order," he barked, but I wasn't listening anymore. My hands shook as I opened the app and blocked him. His messages disappeared instantly, replaced by an eerie silence that hung over me for the rest of the night. It wasn't until later, sitting alone in my room, that the full weight of what had happened hit me. I'd felt uneasy around him from the beginning, but I'd ignored those feelings, convincing myself that I was overreacting. Now, I realized just how close I'd come to something far worse than an uncomfortable date. The next day, I deleted his number and told a few close friends what had happened, partly for my own safety and partly as a reminder to myself that I wasn't being difficult. I was setting boundaries, something he clearly couldn't handle. That experience stayed with me, not because of how it ended, but because of what it taught me. Trusting your instincts isn't just important, it's necessary. And anyone who makes you feel like you're being too much for wanting to feel safe isn't someone worth your time. In hindsight, the red flags had been there all along. I just needed to learn how to see them. The first time I saw her photo on Tinder, I was struck by her smile, bright, confident, and framed by golden blonde hair. Her profile was charming, filled with witty comments and quirky hobbies. She was fluent in German, she mentioned, though it seemed like a throwaway detail at the time. We matched quickly, and our conversations flowed effortlessly. She was funny, engaging, and best of all, seemed genuinely interested in me. Our first date is a blur now, but I remember walking away feeling like I'd hit the jackpot. We met up a few more times after that, each encounter reinforcing how much we clicked. Eventually, I found myself at her place, a cozy apartment filled with books, plants, and an inexplicable collection of miniature figurines. That night, things escalated naturally, and we ended up in her bed. At first, everything was perfect. She was beautiful, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. But somewhere in the heat of the moment, she started shouting in German. It was loud, passionate, and utterly unexpected. I froze for a split second, my mind scrambling to process the sudden switch to a language I couldn't understand. No offense to German speakers, but it's not exactly a language that screams romance. It's more like a drill sergeant barking commands. Her words rolled out in sharp, guttural bursts, and I was equal parts fascinated and terrified. I had no idea what she was saying. Was she complimenting me? Giving instructions? Cursing me out? The sheer unpredictability of it threw me off my rhythm completely. Still, I powered through, convincing myself this was just one of her quirks. It wasn't a deal breaker, just a surprise. A week later, we decided to grab drinks at a local bar she suggested. It was one of those laid-back spots with dim lighting and an impressive collection of craft beers. When we walked in, she greeted the bartender with a familiarity that made me pause. They laughed, exchanged a few words, and he even asked how she'd been. Curious, I asked her how she knew him once he'd stepped away. She smiled casually and said, "Oh, that's my ex-husband." I nearly choked on my drink. "Ex-husband?" I repeated, trying to process what I'd just heard. We were both in our 20s. How did someone our age already have an ex-husband? "Yeah," she said nonchalantly. "We were married for about 2 years. It's cool though. We're still friends." She shrugged it off like it was no big deal, but my mind was reeling. I looked back at the bartender, who was casually wiping down glasses, as if this was the most normal situation in the world. Before I could ask anything else, she excused herself to use the bathroom. The moment she disappeared, the bartender leaned over the counter with a sly grin. "So," he said, his tone dripping with amusement, "how are you liking the German in bed?" I blinked, stunned into silence. Of all the things he could have said, that was the last one I expected. Still caught off guard, I stammered, "It's all right." He winked at me. Before I could gather my thoughts, she returned, sliding into her seat beside me as if nothing had happened. The bartender didn't miss a beat, acting like the brief exchange between us had never occurred. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the whole situation left me with an odd feeling I couldn't shake. She was great, fun, attractive, and smart, but there was something about her unpredictability that made me hesitate. The German outbursts, the casual mention of an ex-husband who happened to be serving us drinks. It was all just a bit much. We hung out a few more times before things fizzled out naturally. There wasn't any dramatic ending, just a quiet realization that we weren't quite the right fit for each other. I still go to that bar occasionally, and every time I do, the bartender greets me with a knowing smile. He always comps my first drink, which I like to think of as a silent acknowledgement of the bizarre shared experience. I'd agreed to meet her here, at a Starbucks, for our first date. It felt casual, low stakes, a safe way to see if there was a spark. Her profile had been intriguing, funny, intelligent, passionate about animal rights. I wasn't vegan, but she'd assured me she was fine with that. The door chimed as she walked in, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail and a brightly colored tote bag slung over her shoulder. She smiled, and for a moment, I felt my nerves settle. She was just as pretty as her photos, and I thought, this could actually go well. We exchanged pleasantries and joined the line. As we waited, she casually mentioned her veganism again, saying it was more than just a diet. It was her way of life. I nodded, listening, and reassured her that I respected her choices. She seemed satisfied with that and smiled, her demeanor calm and confident. When it was my turn to order, I asked for my usual, a coffee with cream. The moment the words left my mouth, the air around us shifted. She froze, her smile vanishing. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a second, I thought I'd misspoken. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo through the entire cafe, she shouted, "You're a cow murderer." Every head in the room turned toward us. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, cups clattered onto saucers, and the baristas paused in their movements, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. My face flushed hot as her words registered. She wasn't joking, she was furious. "You're contributing to the torture and slaughter of innocent animals," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "Do you even know what they go through? You're complicit in their suffering." I stood there, stunned, my mind racing to catch up. This wasn't just a passionate outburst, it was a full-blown scene, and I was at the center of it. People were staring, some whispering, others outright gawking. I tried to stammer out a response, something to defuse the situation, but my words caught in my throat. The barista behind the counter glanced at me nervously, unsure whether to hand over my drink or wait for the storm to pass. "Look," I finally managed, my voice low, "I respect your choices, but this isn't the time or place for this." She didn't hear me, or maybe she didn't care. She was too busy listing the horrors of the dairy industry, her voice trembling with emotion. I could feel my chest tightening, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on me. I hadn't come here to debate ethics or become the target of a public shaming. I'd come for coffee and a conversation. I glanced at the exit, calculating the quickest way out of this situation. My drink was finally placed on the counter, but I didn't even reach for it. Instead, I pulled out my wallet, handed over the cash to pay for both our orders, and said, I think I'll leave. Her expression flickered for a moment, shock, maybe even regret, but she didn't stop me. I grabbed my receipt and headed for the door, the whispers of the other patrons following me like a shadow. The cool air outside hit my face, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. As I walked to my car, I replayed the scene in my mind, each detail sharpening with every step. Her anger, the way she'd weaponized the moment to make a public point, the looks on the faces of strangers, all of it felt surreal. I'd expected differences in opinion, maybe even a light-hearted debate, but not this. When I got home, I blocked her number and deleted our chats. I wasn't angry, not exactly, more bewildered than anything. It was clear we were on entirely different wavelengths, and any chance of a second date had been obliterated in that Starbucks. Later, I told my friends about it, and they laughed, calling it a classic Tinder horror story. But for me, it was more than just an awkward encounter. It was a reminder that some people's passion, no matter how admirable, can blind them to the line between conviction and respect. And as much as I admired her dedication, I knew I needed something simpler, someone who could let me drink my coffee in peace. A few nights ago, I went on a Tinder date with this guy I'd been talking to for about a week. His name was Liam, cute, right? He seemed normal, like actually normal. He wasn't one of those guys who sends, "What you doing?" at 2 a.m. or starts the conversation by commenting on your appearance. He had actual interests: photography, cooking, hiking. His pictures made him look like the artsy, outdoorsy type, handsome, but not in a way that felt intimidating. We'd been messaging back and forth, and he was super charming. He'd ask me thoughtful questions about my favorite books, tell me about the weird places he'd been for photo shoots, and even made me laugh with this ridiculous story about accidentally packing a lens cap instead of his actual lens for a big shoot. I thought, okay, this guy's cool. Let's meet up. Originally, we were just going to grab dinner at this cute Italian place downtown, but the day of the date, he texted me with a new idea. He said he wanted to cook for me instead. He explained that he rents this private venue for his photography sessions, an industrial space that doubles as a studio, and thought it'd be fun to set it up for a cozy dinner. Something different, he said. Now, I know what you're thinking because I was thinking it too. That sounds sketchy. A private venue? On a first date? But he framed it so casually, and he seemed so genuinely excited about the idea, that I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Plus, I shared my location with my best friend before I left, like I always do. So I told myself it was fine. Friends, it was not fine. When I got there, it was already dark, and the building was weird. It was this old industrial warehouse, the kind you'd expect to see in a music video or a gritty indie movie. Not exactly romantic, but when I stepped inside, I saw that he'd tried to make it nice. He'd strung up some fairy lights, set a little table with candles, and even had some cooking equipment off to the side. It was kind of sweet, I guess, but the whole thing still felt off. Liam greeted me with this huge, almost too perfect smile, and handed me a glass of wine. He was charming, as always, and kept saying how glad he was that I'd come. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just overthinking it. We sat down, and he served this pasta dish he'd supposedly made himself. It was good, but here's the first weird thing. He didn't eat. At all. I asked him if he wasn't hungry, and he kind of laughed it off, saying he was more interested in watching me enjoy it. Which, okay, could have been sweet in a weird, overly romantic way, but it didn't feel sweet. It felt like he was studying me. Then came the tattoo. At one point, he leaned over the table to refill my wine, and his sleeve slid up just enough for me to see it. It was small on the inside of his wrist, a date, January 6th, 2019, beneath a thin, simple line. I asked him about it, trying to keep things light. "What's the date for?" "Something special." His whole vibe shifted. His smile froze, and for a split second, I swear I saw something dark flash across his face. Then, just as quickly, he recovered. "It's a reminder," he said, his voice low and even, "of someone important." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, but my stomach was in knots. Something about the way he said it, even the way he looked at me, felt wrong. After dinner, he asked if I wanted another glass of wine, or if I wanted to see the rest of the venue. I said I needed to use the bathroom first, mostly as an excuse to get away for a minute and collect myself. He hesitated before pointing me down the hall, saying something about how it wasn't fully set up yet. As I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I noticed a faint metallic smell. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was sharp enough to make me stop in my tracks. I glanced around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, and that's when I saw it. a door at the end of the hall slightly ajar. I don't know why I looked inside. Curiosity? Stupidity? Whatever it was, I'll regret it forever. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. It had straps, restraints, on the arms and legs. The floor beneath it was stained dark, like something had soaked into the concrete and never fully washed out. I froze. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, but before I could even turn around, I heard him behind me. "Did you get lost?" His voice was calm, but there was something predatory in it now, something that made my blood run cold. I spun around, trying to act casual. "Oh no, I just thought this was the bathroom," I stammered. He looked at me for a long moment, his green eyes unblinking. Then he smiled, this slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The bathroom's back the other way," he said, his tone almost teasing. I forced a laugh, mumbled something about needing fresh air, and bolted back toward the main room. He didn't follow me, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. Once I was outside, I didn't stop. I didn't even wait for my lift. I just kept walking until I reached a gas station and called my friend to come get me. Here's the part that still haunts me. Later that night, I Googled the date on his wrist. January 6th, 2019. It was tied to a news story about an unsolved murder. A woman who had been found bound and stabbed in her apartment. 2 years ago, I matched with someone who seemed almost too good to be true. His profile was everything I could have dreamed of: successful, philanthropic, and kind-hearted. He wasn't just wealthy. He'd made millions through a groundbreaking software invention and used his fortune to give back in ways that resonated deeply with me. Articles online painted a picture of a brilliant, selfless individual. He donated countless computers to underserved students in developing countries and given substantial funds to charities working in sectors I was passionate about. For someone like me, working in philanthropy and striving to make an impact in the world, meeting someone who shared those values was thrilling. I'd grown tired of dating guys who were either too detached or had no direction in life. This was someone who seemed like a real partner, someone with drive, compassion, and a sense of purpose. When we arranged to meet, I was filled with anticipation. But the moment he walked into the cafe, my excitement flickered, then dimmed. Something was off. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't showered in days. A thick gold chain hung awkwardly around his neck, clashing with the image I'd built of him in my head. And then there was his manner, subtle at first, but undeniably strange. He mumbled to himself occasionally, his lips moving as if he were in a private conversation with someone invisible. Still, I reminded myself not to judge too quickly. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he had quirks. It wasn't until the conversation started that I realized just how deep those quirks went. From the very beginning, he was intense. He told me, without hesitation, that he believed in astrology and conspiracy theories. Not just casual ones, but the kind that spiral into complete absurdity. He spoke about psychic powers as if they were an everyday reality, claiming he could manifest people into his life just by thinking about them. "Whenever I need to hire someone," he said with a grin, "I picture them in my mind, and within days they show up in my office." I forced a smile, unsure how to respond. He didn't stop there. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Anderson Cooper is a lizard person," he said seriously, nodding like he'd just shared the world's best-kept secret. I blinked, my brain scrambling to keep up. The logical side of me was ready to shut this down and leave, but I was also fascinated, morbidly curious about how far this conversation would go. This man, who had achieved so much, was sitting across from me talking about psychic powers and reptilian overlords. 2 hours passed in a blur of the strangest, most surreal conversation of my life. And keep in mind, I work with traumatized children displaced from their homes. I thought I'd seen and heard it all. But this was on another level. When the date ended, I politely declined his immediate request for a second. He nodded, seemingly unbothered, but an hour later my phone buzzed. "How about a trip to Paris?" he wrote. "All expenses paid. Just you and me. We'll leave next week." I stared at the message, stunned. When I said no, he escalated. "What if I offered you a $150,000 job at my company?" Another no. "Okay, for $100,000. Final offer." It was baffling. Here was this man throwing money and opportunities at me, as if they could buy my interest, completely oblivious to the fact that I wasn't looking for wealth or grand gestures. I wanted connection, depth, someone grounded in reality. This was the opposite of that. Over the next 6 to 8 months, he continued to reach out sporadically. His messages were bizarre updates about his life, tech deals he'd closed, pictures of himself in exotic locations, musings about his charity work. Sometimes he asked for advice, like I was some sort of consultant for his personal and professional life. I kept my replies brief and polite, hoping he'd take the hint. Eventually, he stopped messaging. He faded into the background, though his Instagram profile occasionally popped up in my, you might consider following, suggestions. I blocked him everywhere, unwilling to leave even a digital door open for him to step through. Looking back, it's almost funny. He wasn't a bad person, just profoundly strange. I think he genuinely believed everything he said, including the conspiracies and psychic powers. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he was searching for something no amount of money or success could give him. Either way, I've never forgotten that date. It was a lesson in appearances, in how someone can seem perfect on paper, but turn out to be something entirely unexpected. And to this day, whenever I hear someone mention lizard people, I can't help but think of him. What a weird guy.